Imagine that pitch-dark and freezing December of 1940. The fate of Western civilization was tied to a thread that grew thinner with every passing hour, on the verge of snapping. When you looked up at the sky, the Battle of Britain had been won. Spitfires had pushed back the German aircraft. But when you came back down to earth, there was another reality. London was burning. The industrial heart of Coventry and Liverpool was being crushed under the Luftwaffe's hammer. On the map, the British Empire still looked magnificent. That famous pink covering a quarter of the world, the lands on which the sun never set. But deep in the gloomy underground war rooms of Whitehall, there was a very different picture. Those running the British government knew a terrible truth. They didn't dare whisper even to the public. The empire was dying not only at the front, but in its treasury as well. They were literally bankrupt. The voice of the free world, Winston Churchill, was sitting at his desk in that underground shelter, writing perhaps the hardest letter of his life. The recipient was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president of the world's richest and most powerful country. Still neutral, Churchill was a master of using words as weapons, but in this letter he had to strike a delicate and humiliating balance. He was confessing to the new leader of the world that the empire of the 19th century banker, the empire that had brought Napoleon to his knees, was penniless. The letter was long and detailed. The submarine threat in the Atlantic, the need for ammunition, the relentless bombings. But the truly poisonous sentences came at the end. Churchill wrote openly, "The British Treasury no longer had the money to buy weapons. The people were ready to fight on the beaches and in the streets, but you cannot fight without ammunition." This was a cry for help. At the same time, it was a silent declaration of bankruptcy. So how had the richest empire in history come to this state? The answer lies in the ruthless economics of total war. When the war began in 1939, Britain was still a giant financial power. Billions of dollars in gold reserves, mines in South America, shares in American industry. The world was, in effect, Britain's vault. But the war Hitler unleashed was unlike previous wars. This was a machine war, a monster that devoured steel, oil, and aluminum without pause. Britain was an island nation and dependent on almost everything. When Europe fell into Nazi hands, trade stopped. Only one direction remained across the Atlantic to America. But America was neutral and its people were isolationist. No one wanted American children to die for a European war. That is why Congress passed the Cash and Carry Act. You pay cash and in gold. No credit, no debt. Britain burned through its treasury in the first year of the war under this system. In an extremely secret operation called Operation Fish, all of the country's gold reserves were loaded onto ships and transported across the submarine-infested Atlantic to Canada. This was one of the greatest transfers of wealth in history. But by the end of 1940, the vault was empty. On British desks in Washington, contracts for planes and tanks that could not be signed due to lack of money were piling up. When Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he saw the picture clearly. He knew that if Britain fell, America would be next. But there was a political obstacle. He could not openly help Britain. The public would oppose it. The solution was to present the aid as a commercial and harmless idea. Thus, Lend-Lease was born. Roosevelt explained it to the public with his famous garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell him the hose, you lend it. Sounds warm and friendly, doesn't it? But behind closed doors, what was happening was not neighborly. It was a foreclosure process. Henry Morgenthau Jr., head of the U.S. Treasury, wanted to see Britain's pockets completely empty before giving a single cent. He demanded a list of every asset the empire and its citizens owned around the world. The British negotiators were shocked. They were being treated not like an ally, but like a bankrupt company. One of the most painful symbols of this process was the American Viscose Company, one of Britain's most valuable industrial investments in the United States. Morgenthau said it plainly, "You will sell this." They resisted, but the threat was clear. If it wasn't sold, Lend-Lease would not pass. In the end, the company was sold for far below its real value. The proceeds didn't even pass through Britain. They went directly to the U.S. Treasury. At that moment, the British elite understood this was not a partnership. This was a survival bargain. Around the same time, Britain requested 50 old American destroyers. In return, America leased strategic bases in the Caribbean and the Atlantic for 99 years. Rusty ships in exchange for the keys to the hemisphere. This was the silent transfer of centuries of dominance. Throughout the war, America's economy grew while Britain gave everything to the front. And on August 15, 1945, the war ended. In London, people poured into the streets, but there was no celebration in Washington. Just 7 days later, Lend-Lease aid was abruptly cut off. Even ships already on the way were ordered to turn back. Britain suddenly found itself without food and without money. John Maynard Keynes went to Washington on one last mission. He asked for a grant. "We went bankrupt saving the world," he said. But the answer was clear. No grant, only a loan, and under heavy conditions. The most dangerous of all was making the pound freely convertible to the dollar. Keynes knew this would be disastrous, but they had no choice but to sign. The winter of 1947 was one of the coldest in British history. Electricity was cut, coal froze, and the pound was floated. What was expected happened. The world sold its pounds, and reserves evaporated. 5 weeks later, the policy was suspended, but the damage was permanent. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to America. "We are out of money. We can no longer carry the burden in Greece and Turkey." This was the moment the Truman Doctrine and American leadership were officially born. Britain was withdrawing from superpower status. The bill for the war was paid over decades. The final installment was closed on December 29, 2006. Even 60 years after the guns fell silent, the price was still being paid. This story shows us one thing. In modern war, there are very few true winners. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Britain won the war but went bankrupt. The only country that truly left the table stronger was America. Churchill saved his country from Hitler, yes. But in those days he also quietly transferred the deed of the empire. This was the most noble, but also the most expensive, bankruptcy history has ever seen. If what I've told you opened a new window in your mind, don't forget to press the subscribe button. The answers are hidden in history. I'll show you where to look.